Good evening. Appreciate the invitation to be with you tonight. I know if you have been keeping up with the original schedule, Nathan Ward was supposed to be the speaker tonight, but he is out of the country, had a scheduling conflict there, so consider me his stunt double for the evening. We're going to talk about Peter, and as Josh already mentioned, if you talk about people who are flawed, Peter's one of the first people you think of. And yet, since our series is called Flawed, Not Failed, we need to think about the fact that obviously nobody thinks of Peter as a failure. Think about how prominent he is. First of all, in the Gospels, Peter's name appears more than 90 times in the Gospels. If you add his given name Simon and his name Cephas, it adds up to over 100. That's far more than any of the other disciples that are mentioned in the Gospels. In any list of apostles, his name is the first on the list, without exception. Along with James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Peter accompanies Jesus in several situations that none of the rest of the apostles were present for, things like the Transfiguration and a couple of other things. The Gospels highlight over a dozen times when Peter said or did something of note, or when something happened that particularly involved him. And again, that's more than just about any of the other apostles. And Peter's often the first one to speak up. That's one of the things we often think about with regard to him. Matthew chapter 16, when Jesus says to the disciples, "Who do men say that I am?" And of course, they're giving all the various opinions that people had about Jesus. And then Jesus said, "Who do you say that I am?" It was Peter who spoke up and said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." In John chapter 6, we read about Jesus saying some things that were very challenging for many folks in his audience. In fact, so challenging, so demanding that John records that many of them left Jesus. They turned away from Jesus and were not walking with him anymore. And so Jesus looked at his disciples, the apostles, and said, "Are you going to go away also?" And it's Peter on that occasion that says, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life." And other occasions, too numerous to mention, where Peter is the one that speaks up first. And sometimes we see Peter being the first one to act. And so in Matthew chapter 14, when we read about an occasion the disciples are out on the boat, and in the late night watches they see Jesus walking on the water to them. Remember, they all first assumed it was a ghost, and they figured out, oh, it's Jesus. And Peter says, "Lord, if it's really you, command that I come out on the water and walk to you." And of course, Jesus said, "Well, come on." Peter's the one who takes that step. In John chapter 20, when the news of that the tomb was empty came to the disciples, it was John and Peter who ran to the tomb. And you may remember from John 20 that John talks about outrunning Peter and then gets there and just kind of looks in. But when Peter gets there, he doesn't just look, he goes in. And that's just the kind of person we think of Peter as being. And then in the next chapter, the disciples are out on the boat again. They see Jesus walking on the seashore, and Peter just jumps in the water and swims to shore. He's so eager to get there to be with Jesus. And other occasions like that. Peter's often the first one to speak, often the first one to act. When Paul lists the appearances Jesus made after his resurrection in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Peter is the first one on the list. An appearance that the Gospels make an allusion to, but don't specifically record. And then there's Peter's leadership in the early church. We open up the book of Acts, and in chapter 1, it's Peter who is proposing to select the replacement for Judas Iscariot, who had taken his own life. And of course, in chapter 2, when the great events of the day of Pentecost occur, it's Peter who takes the lead in explaining to the crowd what's going on and preaches what we often call the first Great Commission sermon, leading to all those thousands of baptisms that day. In chapter 3, Peter, along with John, going to the temple, They encounter this man who's been lame from birth. Peter heals this man, and when the crowd assembles, seeing this man that they knew was lame all his life, and now he's walking, it's Peter who takes that opportunity to preach again, gives another sermon. In chapter 4, as a result of those actions, Peter and John are arrested, and Peter is the one who addresses the Jewish council. In chapter 5, when we read about the sin of Ananias and Sapphira, who is it that confronts them? Yep, it's Peter. And later on in chapter 5, when we read about people who were wanting to be healed of various diseases, it was, Luke says, Peter whom they were seeking out, seeking to just have his shadow fall on them. His name and identity in particular being so closely associated with the healing that they sought. And then, of course, later on in chapter 5, all the apostles are taken into custody and brought before the council, and once again, it's Peter who speaks up and addresses the council. In Acts chapter 8, when converts are made among the cities of Samaria, it's John and Peter who are sent to lay hands on those disciples and impart spiritual gifts to those new converts. And of course, in Acts chapter 10, it's Peter who is the first one to evangelize Gentiles. Just as he was the first one to give a Great Commission sermon to an audience of Jews in chapter 2, now he's the first one to give the gospel to Gentiles. He makes converts of the house of Cornelius. In Acts chapter 12, we read about Herod seizing James and killing him with the sword, executing him, and then we read that Peter was the next target. And that just, I think, reflects the prominence that Peter had. Maybe James was kind of a test run, and Peter was an even larger target in Herod's eyes to try and win over the favor of the people. In Acts 15, we read about Peter having a big role in correcting misconceptions and misapplications of the gospel when it came to Gentile converts. The whole issue of whether Gentiles needed to be circumcised and keep the law. Just the same way that Paul and James spoke up, James the brother of Jesus, so Peter lends his voice to that and sets the record straight. We read about Peter being honored by disciples as far as the city of Corinth. He's mentioned in in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 12. Remember that some of the folks at Corinth were saying, I am of Paul, or I am of Apollos, or I am of Cephas. That's Peter. And some were saying, I am of Christ. That's how popular Peter was. And he's noted by Paul in Galatians chapter 2, noted by Paul approvingly. And Paul talks about the same Spirit who had commissioned and authorized Peter's ministry primarily among the Jews was also the one who authorized and put his seal of approval on Paul's ministry to the Gentiles. Peter wrote 2 inspired letters to Christians scattered in various places in the regions of Asia Minor that we have with us to this day and continue to learn from. And many sources indicate that Peter is to be credited as the primary source for much of the information that is contained in the Gospel of Mark. A failure? Hardly. That's the Peter we think about. And we've left out a number of specific details in talking about that. But of course, anytime we think about Peter, while we think about these things, we also think about a fellow who made some blunders. And it's his flaws we want to be thinking about in the rest of the time we've got tonight, because he was a flawed individual. And it's good that the Scriptures present to us heroes of the faith, warts and all. That's what this whole series has been about. I think that is one of the things that is a good piece of evidence of the truthfulness of the New Testament record, of the biblical record in general, because it presents people like Moses and like David and like Hezekiah and like many others, including Peter. It presents them not as perfect people, hardly. It presents their flaws too. Peter's no exception to that. Peter, for instance, was a man who sometimes spoke without thinking. That may be one of the first things that we think about if we're trying to analyze Peter's flaws. One of the best examples of that is at the Transfiguration, when Jesus took Peter and James and John, one of those occasions when it was just those three accompanying him, up to this high mountaintop, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke all describe Jesus' appearance being transformed before them, his raiment even, and his face being just white and bright, and describes Moses and Elijah appearing and talking with Jesus, talking with him about his departure, which he would accomplish. Peter, in that context, speaks up and says, "Lord, it is so good that we are here. Let's make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." In Mark chapter 9, verse 6, Mark says that Peter didn't know what to say, and so he blurted this out. In Luke's account, chapter 9, he says he said this not realizing what he was saying. Put those two things together. Peter didn't know what to say, but he said something anyway. And as he said it, he didn't really know what he was saying. Now, none of us have ever been guilty of that, right? Does that describe me? Should I be able to relate to somebody who sometimes, at least, spoke without giving it adequate thought? Do I think that I have to speak up and voice my opinion or my suggestions in every single situation? Do I talk when I really ought to be listening? Sometimes Peter did that. In Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 13, Solomon says that he who gives an answer before he hears, it is folly and shame to him. A little bit earlier in that same book, in chapter 10 and verse 19, Solomon says, "In the multitude of words sin is not lacking, but he who restrains his lips is wise." That's just a couple of key passages in Proverbs among many that remind us to be cautious about the things we say. And in the New Testament, Jesus says, "Every careless word that men shall speak, they will give an accounting for it in the day of judgment. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned." All of that combines to remind me I need to make sure my brain's engaged before I put my mouth in gear. It's that simple. Peter was a man who sometimes overreacted to the situation. A great example of that is in John chapter 13 at the Last Supper. John describes after supper Jesus getting up, laying aside his outer garment, girding himself with a towel, taking a water basin, and washing the feet of the disciples. This was what servants typically did. Everybody recognized that. And of course, that was the point. And when Jesus gets to Peter, Peter says, "Never shall you wash my feet, Lord." And Jesus says to him, "Well, then, if I don't wash your feet, then you have no part with me." And Peter says, "Well, then wash me all over. Not just my head, not just my feet, but my hands and my head too." It seems that sometimes, no matter what's going on, no matter what is being said or done, Peter just reacts to it in a way that's a little bit extreme. What about me? Do I lead with my feelings? Do I have a tendency to overreact no matter what the circumstances are? There are too many Bible examples to list of people who let their feelings, whether it was romantic desire or sadness or very often anger, lead the way and lead to disaster. cause them to respond to things in entirely inappropriate ways. A few years ago, college professor Edward Schlosser wrote an article in Vox magazine, and he lamented that so many of his young students have embraced a worldview in which he said, quote, "The feelings of individuals are the primary or even exclusive means through which social issues are understood and discussed." He saw that as a real problem. In fact, he said, "My students terrify me because that's how they look at the world." The point of all this is not that emotions are a bad thing. They're a God-given part of our makeup. The point is that they are useful as servants. They are terrible tyrants when we let them be the master. Proverbs 14 and verse 12 says, "There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death." And speaking of that, there were plenty of times when Peter let his own feelings or his own ideas overshadow what God wanted. Mark chapter 9 at the Transfiguration. "Lord, it's good for us to be here. Let's build some tents so that we evidently, so we can hang out a while. This is what I'm talking about. This is what we need. This is the kind of glory I'm all about. Let's have some more of that." And it was at that point that the cloud came over and God's voice spoke, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." In that moment, that's exactly what Peter needed to hear. Or a chapter earlier, in Mark chapter 8, when Jesus began to tell his disciples, to really highlight to them that his destiny was to go to Jerusalem, to be delivered over to the hands of the chief priests and Pharisees, and to be killed and raised up on the third day. Peter, Mark says, took Jesus aside and started to rebuke him, saying, "Not so, Lord, this will never happen to you." As if Peter's saying to Jesus, no, you don't know how to be a Messiah. This is not how that's supposed to go." You remember what Jesus said to him? "Get behind me, Satan," a name that, of course, means adversary, because in that moment, that's precisely what Peter was. He didn't mean to be, but he had made himself an adversary to God's plan by voicing that opposition to it. And Jesus said, "You are mindful not of God's things, but of man's." What Jesus was proposing didn't match Peter's concept of what the Messiah was supposed to do, of how he thought things ought to go, and so he thought he would just set Jesus straight. What about me? Is it possible that I can get so wrapped up in my own feelings or ideas about what's right that I forget about what God says is right? So wrapped up in my own wants that I forget about what God says He wants. I'm convinced that in many cases where disciples disregard biblical authority, don't pay attention to the scriptural patterns that are set forth for how we organize as a church or how we worship or any number of other things, it's not because they say, "I just don't want to pay attention to what God says." It's usually because they've got ideas about what's going to be, in their view, most effective or most efficient, what's going to bring the most people in, what's going to reach the most people, what's going to do the most good as they see it. They want to see great things happen in the kingdom. I think that's what Peter wanted. He was all about the kingdom. And he thought, in that moment at least, that what Jesus was proposing just didn't match up with that. Good motives don't excuse us from not paying attention to what God says He wants. Peter needed to learn that lesson. Sometimes it was hard for him. His emotions were strong. His ideas were fixed. and it was hard for him to change. It was hard for him to submit to what God wanted. Peter was also a man who sometimes acted without considering how his actions might affect the people around him. Maybe there's no better example of that than Peter's actions in the Garden of Gethsemane when the crowd came to arrest Jesus. Of course, you're aware that Peter, and not just Peter, but all the disciples, had been saying to Jesus, look, whatever happens, we're with you all the way. Whatever happens, we will never abandon you. We will never deny you. The crowd came to take Jesus into custody. A large crowd, an armed crowd, a crowd with official backing. And Peter whipped out a sword, and I don't know exactly what was in his mind, but violence clearly was, and he managed to lop off the ear of the servant of the high priest. I believe all four Gospels mention it. It is John, in John 18, verses 10 and 11, who specifically identifies the sword-swinging disciple as Peter. Did Peter, in that moment, when he was rising to defend Jesus from this onslaught against the kingdom, as he no doubt saw it, and whipped out his sword, did he give any thought to what might happen to the rest of the apostles who were present, what the crowd might do in response to this act of violence? They were terribly outnumbered. And as Jesus makes clear, violence was not remotely his intention. Did Peter give any thought to the possibility that his actions could get somebody killed? Did he give any thought to how he and the other disciples would look? What kind of image this would portray to other people? I'm not sure he did. What about me? Are there times when I act without giving any thought to the way my actions might affect my brothers and sisters? Whether it's my own influence on them or whether it's their influence on others from being associated with me. Peter was a flawed man who sometimes fell apart when things didn't go the way he hoped they would. The night of Jesus' betrayal, Peter said, I will never fall away. He said, even if all these others fall away from you, Lord, I will never fall away. And of course, Jesus told him, truly I say to you, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. But the same Peter who said, I will never fall away, as we just observed, was ready to defend Jesus with violence. I don't know what he thought was going to happen, what he thought Jesus was going to do, but what happened was not what Peter had in mind, surely. And after Jesus rebuked him, put your sword back in its sheath. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword. Do you not think that I could pray to my Father and He would not send at once more than 12 legions of angels that I might not be taken? After Jesus rebuked him, and after Peter watched his master submit quietly and humbly to arrest, what did Peter do then? Well, the Gospels tell us that all the disciples forsook Jesus and fled in that moment, but then we learn that Peter kind of followed at a distance and seemingly along with John gained entrance into the high priest's court. How do you think Peter's feeling in those moments? Again, I don't know precisely what Peter had thought was going to happen, but he's got to be feeling a little bit disappointed and disillusioned. Because whatever he thought was going to happen, it turns out that exactly what Jesus said will happen is what's happening. And what does Peter do? When people start walking up to him and saying, weren't you one of this man's disciples? I know you. You're Galilean. I can tell by the way you talk. You were with them. And 3 times Peter says, I do not know the man. What happened? Oh, fear is at work, no doubt. Peter sees that Jesus has been arrested. He's watching the proceedings in front of the high priest from his vantage point in the courtyard. And fear, no doubt, of what would happen to Jesus and what might happen to anybody who openly identified with Jesus in that moment surely had to be at work. But I have to wonder if there wasn't some disillusionment at work too. This is just not what I envisioned, Peter must have been thinking. What's happened to my plan? What's happened to everything that I hoped for and dreamed for from this Messiah? What about me? When things do not go the way I hoped they would, when things do not go the way I prayed they would, what will I do? In denying Jesus, Peter did what just hours before he thought would be impossible and declared would be impossible for him. He denied Jesus. Why? Because he was shaken by the unexpected. As one speaker put it, the challenge that Peter felt prepared for was not the challenge he ended up facing. What about me? Do we say never the way Peter did? I would never be unfaithful to my spouse, which is easy to say in the sunny days of a joyful marriage, but sometimes situations change. Sometimes people change. Sometimes the price of that fidelity can rise steeply. What will I do then? It's not what I planned for. Not what I wanted to happen, but it might be the reality I'm faced with. What will I do? I would never get involved with drugs or alcohol, which is pretty easy to say when my life is painless and relatively free from heartache. But what if there's misery? What if there's pain? What if the God of the bottle starts to look really good in those moments? What will I do then? I would never steal. I would never deal dishonestly. Is easy to say when my economic life is comfortable and when everything's going pretty much according to plan. What if I lose my job? What if my situation becomes somewhat desperate? What will I do then? Will I still stick by those convictions? Peter fell apart because things didn't go according to plan. And the challenge that he thought he was ready for ended up not being the challenge that faced him. Life is like that. Peter was a man who sometimes gave in to peer pressure. It's not in the Gospels or in the book of Acts that we really read about that. It's in Galatians chapter 2. When a church has been established in the city of Antioch in Syria, the first predominantly Gentile church, Paul is there, Peter comes to Antioch, and Paul says, I had to withstand him to his face because he was to be blamed. What happened? Well, everything was going all right, and Peter was freely associating with his Gentile brethren until some of his brothers from Jerusalem came, and then for whatever reason, probably just fear of what they would think of him, Peter started distancing himself from those Gentile brethren. That was wrong. That was hypocritical. That flew in the face of everything the gospel taught, and that's exactly what Paul highlights when he talks to Peter on that occasion. Peter was not normally a man who gave a lot of, seemed particularly concerned with what other people thought of him, but that day, on that occasion, he faced peer pressure and he folded like a lawn chair. How about me? How do I handle peer pressure? Again, there are more examples than we could count in the Scriptures of people who were led wrong by the influence of the people around them. On this occasion, Peter allowed that to happen. And you notice that we have used the word sometimes to describe these things, because that's just how it was with Peter, as it may be with us. The flaws we're thinking about may not have characterized him every moment of every day, but they were real enough problems that they led to the blunders that we read about in the passages we've considered. But can we take a moment to gain some perspective on Peter's flaws? First of all, I am convinced that many, if not all, of Peter's blunders arose from a heart that sincerely desired to please God. We may snicker a little bit or shake our heads at many of the foibles of Peter, but we have to admit that they were motivated. They are the mistakes of a man who loved the Lord and who wanted to see the glory of God's kingdom. The problem for Peter was simply this: he was convinced of who Jesus was. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Peter had no doubts about that. The struggle for Peter was figuring out how he needed to act in response to that. And that included learning that his own wants, his own preferences, his own feelings were not necessarily God's, and he needed to submit himself to God's will. Is that not the case for all of us who are Christians? For all of us who are disciples of Christ, we are convinced Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. We believe that with all our hearts. The struggle so often is learning to respond properly to that, day in and day out, learning how to think correctly and act correctly in response to Jesus' lordship. That is the process of growth in Christian discipleship for all of us. And may I add that if my brother or sister makes a blunder here or there that looks an awful lot like Peter's, I should consider that the same thing may be at work. They want to serve God. They have a heart that seeks to glorify God. But they're still struggling to figure out exactly how that should translate in their own living, just like we all are. Secondly, despite often making mistakes and often having to be corrected, what you don't see Peter doing is despairing. The closest he comes to that, undeniably, is, well, after his denials. After the rooster crowed, and Jesus turned and looked at Peter from within the house of the high priest. Jesus could look and see Peter. Peter heard the rooster crow. He saw Jesus. He realized what he had just done. That 3 times he had denied knowing Jesus, exactly like Jesus said he would. And the Bible says that he went out and wept bitterly. I expect that was the lowest point in Peter's life. But what Peter didn't do was take the path of Judas Iscariot, who, following his own betrayal of Jesus and his own remorse for it, just went out and ended it all by taking his own life. And so, when we read about the resurrection of Jesus, where do we find Peter? Still among the disciples. When the news comes to them, the tomb is empty. Who runs to the tomb? It's Peter along with John. When Jesus appears to the disciples, which of the apostles does he appear to first? 1 Corinthians 15 says it was Peter. And in John chapter 21, when Jesus talked with Peter, 3 times asked him, Simon, do you love me? And Peter, with some pain, said, Lord, you know I love you. And Jesus said, tend my sheep. When Peter was given once again renewed purpose, Jesus let him know, I am not done with you. Peter did not shrink from that. And then we open up the book of Acts, and we find that powerful leader among the disciples that we talked about at the beginning of our lesson tonight. Third thing, Peter learned from his mistakes and grew. In Romans chapter 5 and verses 3 and 4, Paul has this to say. It's Romans 5. Paul talks about our exulting in Christ and our exulting even in hardships, even in tribulations. Romans 5 and verse 3, not only this, we exult in our tribulations, knowing that tribulation brings about perseverance, and perseverance, proven character, and proven character, hope. That in the life of a disciple, Paul says, hardship is supposed to bring endurance or perseverance, and it is supposed to result in proven character, what one writer called tried integrity. In other words, it's supposed to make us better equipped to face the hardships of the future. Some tribulations that we experience will be the result of our own foolishness. We experience hardships because we chose badly. Maybe not even sinfully, but we made a foolish choice. Now, we can still learn from those. The point is, will I learn from them, or will I instead choose to do what a lot of people in our culture do? And that's simply to point the finger of blame at someone or something else, anything but me, and not learn a thing from those mistakes, and just keep right on going and keep repeating those mistakes. Peter didn't do that. Peter made lots of mistakes. There were lots of times Jesus had to say, no, Peter, that's not the way we're going. No, Peter, that's not the way it's going to be. Peter learned from those. Peter kept going forward. Look at his own words in the letter of 1 Peter in chapter 4. 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 15. He says, make sure none of you suffers as a murderer or thief or evildoer or troublesome meddler. But if anyone suffers as a Christian, he is not to be ashamed, but is to glorify God in this name. Or back in chapter 2 and verse 20, what credit is there when you sin, if when you sin and are harshly treated, you endure it with patience? But if when you do what is right and suffer for it, you patiently endure it, this finds favor with God. And of course, Peter showed a continued willingness to learn and grow. The episode in Acts chapter 10 where Peter requires some persuasion from the Holy Spirit to even go to the house of a Gentile, but soon learns and confesses, now I know. God is no respecter of persons, but in every nation, the one who does right, the one who seeks Him and fears Him is acceptable to Him. Let's recap really quick. The New Testament in Peter presents a man who sometimes spoke when he ought to be listening, who sometimes spoke and acted rashly with little thought to the effects of his actions, who sometimes overreacted to the situation, whatever the situation was. A man who sometimes let his emotions or his ideas overshadow God's will. A man who sometimes fell apart when things didn't go the way he planned. A man who sometimes caved to peer pressure and was still somebody that God used to benefit His kingdom. Jesus gave Peter the Aramaic name Cephas, Kephas, rock, and reiterated that same thing in the name Peter, Petros, rock. It was a name Peter didn't always live up to. But it was one Jesus continued evidently to regard as fitting for him. That is a reminder that the Lord sees in us what we may struggle to see in one another or even ourselves. He is faithful. By faith in Him and by His grace, even flawed people don't have to be failures. Let's learn from Peter and think about what God can do through us. Thanks for your attention tonight.